Welcome back to another episode of Smooth Brain EDH, where we make the smoothest plays with the biggest brains. We're back for another round of gameplay with the all-new commanders from Kamigawa, Neon Dynasty, so let's see what everyone brought to the table. First up is Logan on Tatsunari, Toad Rider. This is a Sultai enchantment deck, hoping to cast enchantments to make a frog and drain opponents' life totals. He starts the game with a Swamp, Otawara Soaring City, Strip Mine, Flooded Grove, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Fertile Ground, and Haunted on Life's Web. Next up is Ethan, bringing back Hinata, Dawn Crowned. This is a Jeskai artifact combo deck using Hinata to make powerful draw and control spells cost very little mana. He keeps a hand with Rogran Triome, Glacial Fortress, Flooded Strand, Soul Ring, Talisman of Conviction, Prophetic Prism, and Dramatic Reversal. Our third player today is Sam on Go-Shintai, A Life's Origin. The new 5-color Shrines commander is here, hoping to value opponents out with effects that increase in power with more shrines around the field. His starting hand has an Island, Boseiju Who Endures, Exotic Orchard, Reliquary Tower, Farseek, Enchantress's Presence, and a Smothering Tithe. Last is Chandler on Satoru Umezawa. This deck plans to play cheap and evasive creatures, then uses Commander's ability to cheat in powerful creatures while controlling the board with counter magic and removal. His starting hand has a Swamp, Underground Sea, Blinkmoth Nexus, Spectral Sailor, Douthie Voidwalker, Toxic Deluge, and a Mana Drain. We're about to hop right into it, but before that, go ahead and leave us a comment on who you hope will take home the victory this game. While you're down there, go ahead and give us a like and subscribe. We post gameplay videos every week and new episodes of our podcast every other week, so subscribe so you don't miss any of our new content. Links to the deck list and social media will be in the description. Also, we have created a community Discord for viewers to talk about everything Magic and interact with us. Link to that is also in the description below. Now, on to the gameplay.
Logan wins the die roll, he plays a Morphic Pool and passes. Ethan plays a Rogran Triome and passes himself. Sam will play an Island and then pass to Chandler, who plays an Underground Sea and then passes back to Logan. Logan plays a Flooded Grove into a Fertile Ground and then passes to Ethan. Ethan will play Glacial Fortress and then cast a Soul Ring. After this, he'll tap for 3 more and cast Foundry Inspector. The turn is then passed to Sam, who plays an Exotic Orchard. He'll then tap for 2 and cast a Farseek, and he'll pass to Chandler while searching for a Savai Triome, and on his end step, Chandler flashes in Spectral Sailor. Now on his turn, Chandler will play a Swamp and then tap for 2, casting Dauthi Voidwalker. He then moves to combat, swings for 1 at Ethan, and then passes the turn to Logan. Logan will start his turn off with a Dryad of the Elysian Grove. He'll then play a Swamp and a Strip Mine as his 2 lands for turn. After this, he'll pass the turn to Ethan. Ethan will start off with a Flooded Strand, and then cast a Talisman of Conviction. Thanks to the Foundry Inspector, it was only 1 mana, so he'll also drop a 1-mana Prophetic Prism and draw a card when it enters. He'll then cast a Scrap Welder, and then move to combat, swinging Foundry Inspector at Sam, and then pass the turn to Sam. Now on his turn, Sam will play a Swamp as land for turn, then taps for 4 to cast a Smothering Tithe. The turn is then passed to Chandler, who doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe on his draw step. He'll then play a Blinkmoth Nexus as land for turn, then tap for 3 and cast his commander, Satoru Umezawa. He then moves to combat and swings Spectral Sailor at Ethan and Dauthi Voidwalker at Logan. The turn is then passed to Logan, and Logan will pay for Smothering Tithe. He'll then play Otawara Soaring City and a Verdant Catacombs as his 2 land drops this turn. He'll then fetch with the Verdant Catacombs, losing a life, and it'll get exiled by Dauthi Voidwalker with a counter on it. He'll grab an Underground Sea with it, and then tap for 3 to cast his commander, Tatsunari Toad Rider. After this, he'll tap for 2 and Frogify Chandler's commander, Satoru. When he casts this, Tatsunari will trigger, and Logan will make a Kaimi token. Logan will then pass, and Ethan will fetch with Flooded Strand on his end step, and it gets exiled with Dauthi Voidwalker. Ethan finds a tapped Steam Vents to the battlefield. Now in his turn, he'll also pay for Smothering Tithe, and then plays an Arid Mesa as land for turn. He'll then tap for 4 and cast his commander, Hinata Dawn Crowned. He then thinks a little while longer, but just ultimately decides to pass to Sam. And Sam starts his turn off with an Enchantress's Presence. He'll then play a Reliquary Tower as land for turn, then tap for 3 to cast a Honden of Infinite Rage. When he does, he'll draw a card. The turn will then be passed to Chandler, who once again does not pay for Smothering Tithe. He'll then move straight to combat and swing for 2 at Logan, hoping to get him to block so Satoru will go back to the command zone. Logan, however, does not block and just takes the 2 damage. Post-combat, Chandler will sacrifice his Dauthi Voidwalker to get Ethan's Flooded Strand. The Voidwalker says play and not cast, so Chandler is able to play it as his land for turn. He'll then tap for 3 mana and cast Toxic Deluge, paying 4 life to give all creatures -4/-4. The board is wiped, and all 3 commanders are put back into the command zone. The turn will then be passed to Logan, who plays a basic Swamp as land for turn. Sam asks him here in a second if he wants to pay for Smothering Tithe, and Logan does. Logan will then tap for 5 and cast Tatsunari again. He'll then pass the turn to Ethan, who fetches on his end step for a tapped Hollowed Fountain. Now in his turn, he does not pay for Smothering Tithe, and he'll tap for 6 mana to recast his commander, Hinata. He'll then pass the turn to Sam, who deals 1 damage to Ethan's face on his upkeep with his Honden. Now in his main phase, he'll cast an Idyllic Tutor to find a Honden of Cleansing Fire to his hand. He'll then cast the Honden, drawing a card off Enchantress's presence, and then pass the turn to Chandler. Chandler will stop him on his end step and fetch with Flooded Strand to find a tapped Watery Grave. Unfortunately, Sam misses a Smothering Tithe trigger during Chandler's draw step, and on Chandler's main phase, he'll play a tapped Creeping Tar Pit and then pass the turn to Logan. Logan will pay for Smothering Tithe, then tap for 5 to cast a Honden of Life's Web. And when he does, he gets to create another frog token. After this, Logan will move to combat and swing for 3 at Sam, who has no choice but to take it. The turn will then be passed to Ethan, who does not pay for Smothering Tithe. Now in his main phase, Ethan senses a potential counterspell at the table, so he slams down a Galazeth Prismari to potentially bait it out, but it resolves and he'll get a treasure token. Ethan will then float all of his mana and drop a Reality Spasm X's 8, untapping his mana sources and leaving open 3 red. Thanks to Hinata, it only cost him 2 blue, but Chandler responds with a quick mana drain. The spell is then countered, and since X was 8, Chandler gets 10 colorless mana on his next main phase. Luckily though, Ethan still has his 3 red mana floating, so he'll cast a Soulfire Eruption, targeting all his opponents and all the creatures on the battlefield, making it only cost that 3 red mana. The spell will resolve, and for each target, Ethan will exile a card off the top of his library, the target will take damage equal to the CMC, and Ethan gets to play those cards till the end of his next turn. He flips a Faithless Looting for Hinata and a Scalding Tarn for Galazeth, Lightning Greaves for Sam's face, an Icy Blast for Chandler's face, Reconstruct History for Logan's face, Repeal for Tatsunari, and a Whirlwind of Thought for Kimmy the Frog, unfortunately making it the only thing that died to this Soulfire Eruption. Ethan will then play the Scalding Tarn as land for turn, and then after this pretty spooky turn, he'll pass the turn to Sam. On his upkeep, Sam will point 2 damage at Ethan and gain 4 life thanks to his 2 shrines. Now in his main phase, he'll play a Myriad Landscape as land for turn. And after seeing all the mana Chandler's going to get next turn, he senses there's probably a board wipe, so instead of casting his commander, he decides to drop Dryonic Resonator and just pass the turn. Chandler will not pay for Smothering Tithe, and then gets 10 colorless mana from the mana drain. He'll then play his own Flooded Strand as land for turn, and immediately fetch with it for a basic island. After this, Chandler wants to be as mana efficient and set back his opponents as much as possible this turn, so he'll float a blue, and then use 6 of the colorless to overload a Cyclonic Rift. Ethan will respond by fetching with his Scalding Tarn for a basic island. He'll then cast Repeal X is equal to 0, targeting one of Sam's treasure tokens, so he can draw a card. And Ethan will not pay for the new Smothering Tithe trigger. And so, after everything resolves, the board is bounced, and Chandler continues with his turn. He'll then use 3 of that colorless, and then pay an extra blue and black to recast his commander, Satoru. The turn will then be passed to Logan, and Logan will start off by casting his commander again. He'll then cast Fertile Ground on his swamp, and get his 3/3 frog again. He'll then tap for 2 and cast Go-Shintai of Lost Wisdom, and everyone gets drained for 1. And after this, Logan will pass the turn to Ethan. And Ethan will start off by recasting his Soul Ring. He'll then tap it to cast an Izzet Signet, and then tap it and a land to cast his Talisman again. He'll then tap for 4 mana and cast Reconstruct History from exile. He returns Soulfire Eruption, Reality Spasm, and Foundry Inspector back to his hand. He'll then pass the turn and discard Jeskai Ascendancy and Prophetic Prism. Now on Sam's turn, he'll play Boseiju Who Endures as land for turn. He'll then recast his Enchantress's presence, and his Smothering Tithe as well, drawing a card when he casts it. The turn is then passed to Chandler, who does not pay for Smothering Tithe during his draw step, and he'll immediately move to combat, swinging Satoru at Ethan. When Ethan doesn't block, Chandler ninjutsus in Yoriko, the Tiger's Shadow. When he activates the ninjutsu ability, Satoru lets him look at the top 3, then put 1 to his hand. And when Yoriko deals damage, Chandler will flip a Notion Thief off the top, and each of his opponents will lose 4 life. He'll then recast Satoru Umezawa, and then pass the turn to Logan, who doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe on his draw step. Logan, seeing as Ethan's probably going to have a pretty explosive turn next turn, decides to drop a Druid of Purification, targeting Ethan's Soul Ring when it enters the battlefield. Ethan will choose Sam's Smothering Tithe, Sam will choose Ethan's Izzet Signet, and Chandler will choose Enchantress's Presence. After all 4 targets have been chosen, they'll be destroyed. Logan will then move to combat and swing Frog at Ethan and Frog Rider at Sam. Post-combat, Logan will tap for 3 and cast a Citizen Champion. He'll then move to his end step and pay 1 to his shrine to make Ethan mill a Crackle with Power. Now on Ethan's turn, he'll shock in a Sacred Foundry, and then taps for 4 mana to recast Hinata from his hand. Seeing this as a chance to potentially go off, Ethan will recast Reality Spasm to untap all of his lands again. Chandler will respond by casting Force of Will, paying the extra 1, paying a life, and then exiling Kyrie, the new blue dragon. Because if Ethan gets to untap all of his lands, he gets to cast a 3 mana Soulfire Eruption again, and potentially win the game this turn. Unfortunately now tapped out, Ethan will pass the turn to Sam. And Sam starts out with a Ketria Triumph tapped. He'll then tap for 3 mana and cast a Satyr Enchanter. And after this, he'll tap for 4 more to cast his Honden of Cleansing Flame again. And when he does, he'll draw a card. The turn will then be passed to Chandler. And Chandler asks the board if they're still worried about Ethan getting a Soulfire Eruption off next turn. The answer from Sam and Logan is yes. So Chandler asks if they'll let Yuriko and Satoru through, so he can potentially dig for another counterspell or another answer. And they both agree. So Chandler will move to combat and swings Yuriko at Logan and Satoru at Sam. Upon no blocks, Chandler will pay 4 mana and ninjutsu in his Notion Thief. When he does, he'll look at the top 3 cards of his library and put 1 to his hand. Then when Yuriko connects, Chandler will flip a swamp and none of his opponents lose life. He'll then play the swamp, tap for 3, and cast the Petty Theft side of Brazen Borrower, bouncing Hinata. And after this, Chandler is tapped out, so he passes the turn to Logan. Logan plays a basic forest as land for turn, and then recasts his Honden of Life's Web. When it enters, he'll put a 1/1 counter on his champion, and Chandler will draw a card thanks to Notion Thief. Also, when he casts it, all of his opponents lose a life and he'll gain a life. Logan will then move to combat and full swing at Ethan, which is a total of 10 damage. The turn will then be passed to Ethan, who immediately starts off by recasting Hinata and taking 1 to his talisman. He'll then drop Soulfire Eruption for only 3 mana again, declaring all creatures and all players as his targets. You guys already saw how this works, so let's start flipping cards. For himself, Ethan flips a Riddlesmith. Hinata gets a Lotus Petal. Satyr Enchanter gets a Seed of the Synod. Notion Thief gets Ichor Wellspring, which kills it. Yuriko gets Reality Chip. Druid of Purification gets KCI, killing it. Champion gets Marsh Flats. Kami gets Burgi, God of Storytelling, killing it. Tatsunari gets an Island. Logan's Go-Shintai Creature gets Smothering Tithe, killing it. Sam's face gets Thought Monitored. Chandler's face gets Indomitable Creativity. And finally, Logan's face gets a Plains. All these cards are now exiled, and Ethan can play all of them until the end of his next turn. And he'll start by playing Seed of the Synod as land for turn, and then casting Lotus Petal. Then, using that 2 mana, he'll cast a Reality Chip. And Ethan, with a ton of resources to potentially win next turn, passes to Sam. And Sam will gain 2 life on his upkeep. Now in his main phase, he'll tap for 3 to cast Honden of Infinite Rage. When he does, he draws a card, and then he plays a Windswept Heath as land for turn. He'll then cast a Go-Shintai of Ancient Wars, which draws him yet another card. He then fetches for a basic Plains, and then taps for 5 mana to cast Wargate, X is equal to 2. He finds a Kenrith Transformation to the battlefield and attaches it to Hinata. Since it was never a spell that was put on the stack, it does not cost 1 extra. After all this, the turn is passed to Chandler. And Chandler starts off by recasting his commander. He'll then move to combat and swing Yuriko at Logan. Logan can't block, so Chandler will tap for 4 and ninjutsu in a Hullbreaker Horror. When he activates this ability, Chandler can look at the top 3 cards of his library and puts 1 to his hand. Logan will then take 7 damage from the Hullbreaker Horror. Now in his second main, Chandler plays Fairy Conclave as land for turn, and then passes the turn to Logan. And Logan will get to make a 1/1 on his upkeep. Not wanting to let a Hullbreaker Horror stick on the board, Logan drops a Damnation, and it resolves, destroying all creatures. The turn is then passed to Ethan. And Ethan will start off by casting Burgi, God of Storytelling. This essentially lets the table know that he is going for it this turn. He then recasts his Foundry Inspector and gets a red mana when he casts it. He then drops KCI, getting another mana. He then casts what is essentially a free Ichor Wellspring because it only costs 1 mana and it makes a mana when he casts it, and he'll draw a card when it enters. He'll then cast a free Jeweled Lotus, getting another mana, then sacrifices the Ichor Wellspring to get 2 mana with KCI and also drawing another card. He'll then drop Dockside Extortionist, getting a mana from Burgi and 4 treasures when it resolves. He'll then cast Galazeth Prismari, getting a mana and another treasure. Ethan then starts counting how many spells he's cast this turn, which is terrifying. He's cast 7 so far, and Logan lets him use his side of the board to count it. Ethan will then tap all of his artifacts to make 3 blue mana and 4 red mana. He'll then use 1 of each to cast Dramatic Reversal, untapping all of his non-land permanents. Unfortunately, Ethan makes a mistake here by casting a Thought Monitor with Galazeth Prismari mana. I will say though, this is a pretty minor mistake. He had the treasures to cast it anyway, he just accidentally used the wrong mana. So he'll draw 2 cards when it enters. He'll then tap KCI for another blue and cast a Reality Heist. He also remembers to move the spell count up to 10, but forgets to get his Burgi mana. With Reality Heist, he'll reveal Arcane Signet and Felwar Stone from the top 7 of his library, and then go to his hand. He then decides it's time to drop an Aether Flux Reservoir by using all of his Burgi mana, but it gets him another 1 back. He'll then drop his Felwar Stone, which is only 1 mana, and also gets a mana from Burgi. When he does, he'll gain 12 life. He then drops a 1 mana Arcane Signet, which gets him yet another mana from Burgi, and he'll also gain another 13 life, making the table sweat. He'll then sacrifice his Jeweled Lotus for 3 blue mana, use all of his Burgi mana, sacrifice Thought Monitor to KCI, and then tap for the remaining white to recast Hinata, gaining 14 life, and then getting another mana from Burgi. He'll then tap all of his treasures to get 5 more mana, 3 more blue and 2 more red. He'll then tap for 3 red mana to cast Indomitable Creativity, X is equal to 5. He targets all 5 of his treasures, and then gains 15 life. And while he technically should only have 4 treasures, he could have also targeted his dockside. And thanks to Hinata, this spell only cost him 3 mana. And so all 5 treasures are destroyed, and he starts flipping. His first hit is an Ethereum Sculptor, then a Jeweled Amulet, then a Joyra Weatherlight Captain, a Great Furnace, and finally a Cloud Key. These all will be put into the battlefield, and when Cloud Key enters, he names artifacts. This makes his artifacts cost a total of 3 less to cast. Moving on, he'll cast a Ponder using his Galazeth mana, gaining 16 life. He shuffles off the Ponder and draws a card. He'll then cast his Riddlesmith, gaining 17 life. He'll then tap for 2 more mana, and then sacrifice his Jeweled Amulet to KCI to cast Smothering Tithe, gaining 18 life. And finally, Ethan will tap his Cloud Key and his Aetherflux Reservoir for 2 white and show a Heliod's Intervention. With the 5 mana he already has floating, and all the artifacts he can sack to KCI, he can gain far more than enough life to kill everyone, plus he'll gain another 19 from Aetherflux. Unfortunately, nobody at the table can really do anything to stop Ethan from doing this, so everyone just decides to concede. So congrats Ethan, way to go on this victory. That was awesome. Well, there you go everybody. If anything, this game really shows off how powerful Hinata can be with the right setup. I will say though, each of the other decks had a good showing too. Having 2 decks at the tables that both run shrines was pretty interesting to see. And while Sam never did actually cast his commander, a lot of the talk at the table had to do with board wipes and Ethan's board, so he didn't really want to cast into it, and I can't blame him. Also, after doing a little bit of research, I just found out Chandler's 10 mana drain is the biggest one we've captured on camera, so I guess a new record today. But as always you guys, thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in the deck lists, they'll be down below, and while you're down there, check out our social media pages and join our new Discord. I really hope you enjoyed our Kamigawa Neon Dynasty videos, and as always everyone, have a smooth day.